take your Bible out and open to Matthew chapter 16. I'd like to spend our time this session in Matthew chapter 16 and 17. Most of you are familiar with this text. We're going to be talking about on this rock and making our way eventually to highlighting the transfiguration of Jesus. The context, though, begins here in the 16th chapter. In Matthew 16 and verse 13, we're told that Jesus and the apostles are in Caesarea Philippi. That is not an obscure detail. That's an important detail, a helpful detail. And on that occasion, as most of you know, Jesus asks the disciples who other people said he was. There was quite a buzz in that region about Jesus, and some thought he was John the Baptist, and others Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. And then, much more personal of a question, Jesus says, well, who do you think I am? You ever been put on the spot? It's easy to talk about other people, but, well, what do you think? And that can be uncomfortable. But Peter replies, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds to him, essentially saying that, yes, that's the right answer. You did not come to that conclusion on your own. That was shown to you. That was revealed to you. And there's numbers of ways perhaps we could explain how that truth had been revealed to him. Quite frankly, the only reason we know anything at all about God, about the Christ, is because of revelation, not discovery. And Jesus goes on to tell him that on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Again, a very familiar saying of Jesus, a critical one in his ministry, a critical one in the development of the Gospel of Matthew. This is the only place in Matthew where the word church is used here in the text. And then as we move on a little further, we find that Jesus begins to explain his death. And what's significant about that, as they're in Caesarea Philippi talking about who he is, the confession that he is the Christ is discussed. They'd never heard this message before. They'd never heard that Jesus was going to go to Jerusalem to give himself over to the leaders, die, and be raised the third day. That was news to them. And we recognize it to say, well, that's the gospel, and the gospel's good news, but that's not how Peter and the apostles took the news. It was bad news. It was confusing news. None of it made sense. How can you have a king? Or how can you have a kingdom without a king? That's what the Messiah was, after all. And Jesus, he rebukes Peter. He says, get behind me, Satan. He says, you don't know what you're talking about. And then takes the opportunity to explain more broadly the nature of his kingdom and about the critical importance of sacrifice and self-denial. So all of that is in the background. I want to talk about on this rock. And I want to give some insight, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to do it in this session, perhaps to give some more insight into, well, the real context of this scene. The discussion and debate and arguing that goes on with Jesus and the apostles for 6 days, and then the subsequent transfiguration, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John on a high mountain. A high mountain. What mountain was that? I began by telling you that Matthew gives us a very important detail in verse 13. That they're in Caesarea Philippi. Maybe we'd wonder, well, what mountain is in Caesarea Philippi? Well, it was Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon, the only rock in that region. I want to talk about Mount Hermon a little bit here. If you have the note sheet, there's some space there. You might want to jot a couple of things down. And I would imagine that, I would hope at least, that the things that I'm going to tell you about Mount Hermon this morning would spark some further investigation, particularly into the supernatural worldview of the Bible. The supernatural worldview of the Bible has been obscured. It has been ignored. It has been even dismissed. Perhaps this morning, looking at some things biblically will help show that, well, it needs to be focused on so that we can better understand how a scene like we have in Matthew 16 would have been understood by those who participated in it. How would the apostles have understood all of what Jesus was saying and what they would witness? How would it have been taken? To begin with, Mount Hermon is a very significant site, and that cannot be understated. Mount Hermon is located in the region of Bashan. And again, you say, well, Mount Hermon, I don't know much about that. The region of Bashan, so what? Again, it has deep significance as it relates to the supernatural worldview of the Bible, as it relates to spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare. Now, when you come across texts that deal with these types of things, we're often perplexed. I mean, you read something like what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6 about spiritual wickedness in high places, and we've got to put on the armor of God. And our takeaway is, that'd make a good text for a VBS. And dress our kids up like a Roman soldier. And that's far, far removed from what Paul would have thought about the reality of spiritual warfare, the reality in which you and I are part, whether or not we realize it. Bashan is associated with the serpent. Bashan was the domain of the dead. It was the domain of the dead. The domain of the Rephaim and the Anakim. Do you know who the Rephaim are? Who the Anakim are? I'm not making this up. It's those details that we just skip over as we read and study something like the conquest of Canaan. Again, another story that's great for our kids. We get to talk about giants and big pieces of fruit. And the realities there are just lost on us. Now, the realm of the dead, the realm of the Rephaim, the Anakim, we're told in Deuteronomy, places like Deuteronomy 2, chapter 2 and chapter 3, well, they are the descendants of the Nephilim. There's another group that we don't know a lot about or just would skip right over in reading Genesis chapter 6. Who are the Nephilim? Well, the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God who came down from heaven and took wives among men and had children. And that is the context of the flood. And what happens through that is, in the first 4 verses of Genesis 6, it leads to the corruption of, the human family, to the point where God seeks to destroy the earth with a flood. The sons of God, when they came down, where did they go? Well, Genesis 6 doesn't tell us, but there are other ancient texts which do, and it was generally understood that Mount Hermon was the site. Mount Hermon was the place where that happened. That's where they came down. And that's why Mount Hermon was always associated with evil, death, and the demonic. That's why Israel would build a cult center for Beelzebub, the Lord of the dead, in their idol worship. That's why they went there to do it, to engage with it. This term, this name, Beelzebub, sometimes as it comes across, is later associated to Satan. Again, I hope I'm raising lots of questions for you. This is the place. This is the place where the conquest of Canaan began. The conquest of Canaan, we say, well, they had to drive out the Canaanites. Yeah, they did. And who were they? Again, when you go to Deuteronomy and you can read about that, they are the remnants of the Nephilim. And of course, Israel's not successful in doing all of that. But Mount Hermon is the place where this happens. You can read, for example, there's ancient Sumerian texts that identify that. There are some ancient texts that the Jews read during the Second Temple period, particularly the book of Enoch, which doesn't describe the sons of God, it describes the watchers. Now, is Enoch, what do you make of Enoch? Well, it's not canonical, it's not inspired, but it was a book that all of the Jews read and were familiar with, so much so that when Jude and Peter recount the history of the world, they quote from the book of Enoch in 1 Peter and in the letter that Jude wrote. So this is information, again, that the ancients knew and understood, didn't need an explanation the likes of which I'm trying to give to you this morning. So what's happening here? We said that the conquest of Canaan begins really in the area of Bashan. And as far as the ministry of Jesus, when you look at Mark, which is the earliest of the Gospels that we have recorded, the ministry of Jesus really begins in this area. Galilee and Bashan, you can look at a map. I don't have one here, but it's all in the same area. And in the book of Mark, what stands out in terms of the miracles that Jesus performs is more than anything else, he's casting out demons. Casting out demons. I wonder why. Now, this is the place of Peter's confession and where the transfiguration happens. It's significant. It's significant. Peter confesses that Christ is Lord. Christ is King, the Son of the living God. At that place. The transfiguration happening in Mount Hermon. It is as if there is warfare going on. And God, through Christ and by the Spirit, are reclaiming that place. That place. I mean, the reason why Jesus was sent here, after all, was to reclaim what? It's to reclaim us. It's to reclaim the human family. He's seeking to undo the corruption that infiltrated the world beginning back in Genesis 6. And I know that, well, you say sin came into the world in Genesis 3 in the fall, and that's true and important. But in terms of understanding why human corruption existed in the world, the ancients, their minds would have gone to Genesis 6. On this rock, Jesus says, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. On this rock. Again, when we look at this text, we often say, well, the Catholics say the rock is Peter. We believe the rock is Christ. And there's this play on words, and we start explaining from other texts, from like 1 Corinthians 10, about how Christ is the rock. Christ is described as a rock, a precious stone. No one would dispute that. That's not how that would have been understood. The only rock in Caesarea Philippi was Mount Hermon. The gates of hell in the time in which Jesus lived was the entry point to the realm of the dead. Canaanite hell is how it was understood. The god of Pan was worshipped during that period when Matthew 16 is actually unfolding. Jesus says the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Another way of explaining that phrase is that the gates of hell will not withstand against it. You see what is happening is that Jesus is assaulting hell. Jesus is assaulting death. He is assaulting Satan himself. And he says that there's nothing that's going to stop me from conquering death, from conquering Satan. This realm of the dead, this realm of Satan is going to ultimately become his tomb through the things that Jesus is accomplishing by coming here to rescue those who were made in the image of his Father. So that's a little bit about Mount Hermon and the importance of that rock. If we go to chapter 17, though, and notice the transfiguration, it's quite an incredible scene that is described to us. And certainly by now your imagination is at work. So you could imagine what this must have looked like as Peter, James, and John were taken up on a high mountain there in verse 1 by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we're here. For if you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He was still speaking, and behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And a voice from the dead cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and have no fear. And they lifted up their eyes. They saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And the disciples asked him, Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? He answered, Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. And the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. So, out of this scene, there are some important lessons that we can take away in terms of who Jesus is and what he is going to accomplish through his death and resurrection. To begin with, we would understand that there's no one like Jesus. And the apostles had started to realize that. Certainly they had not fully realized this. None of what I'm talking about was fully known or understood by anyone. As I said this morning, we don't learn through discovery, we learn through revelation. I mean, Paul would later write, had the kings of the rulers of this world known who Jesus was, they wouldn't have done what they did. It is only through revelation that all of this begins to be understood, that there's no one like him. Now they know that he's special. They know that he's special, but they continue to think about him, and even as was acknowledged when Jesus first asked them, Who do people think I am? Jesus is viewed as being like one of the prophets. There's some questions certainly that they would have had about him, but it is as if they could at least think that, well, what we're seeing in Jesus has been seen before in earlier periods of our history. And what the Transfiguration demonstrates is that, no, you haven't seen anything or anyone like him. He is unique in every sense of that word, right? There are not degrees of unique. It's either something you are or you are not. Jesus is unique. And that's made clear through this transfiguration. Again, we wonder what all of this looked like. What were they seeing? What were they hearing? This light, this bright light. It is as if for just a brief moment they caught a glimpse of his divinity. They see Elijah and Moses there. And the response of Peter, like a good God-fearing Jew, was, let's make tabernacles. We'll worship all 3 of you. And that would have been fine if Jesus was on the same level as Elijah and Moses, but he's not. He's superior. Of course, the Scriptures bear that out. His superiority ultimately is going to be demonstrated by his being raised from the dead and coronated at the right hand of the throne of God. The transfiguration is a symbol of what is coming in regards to that. There's no one like Jesus. So it certainly demands that we would give him greater consideration in our lives and learning about who he is and how he has been revealed to us. Secondly, and this certainly fits the context, is that Jesus is conqueror. Jesus is conqueror. Now, as it relates to the supernatural worldview of the Bible, it is quite interesting, and there are lots of questions that could be raised about it. What is perfectly clear from Genesis 3 to Revelation is that Jesus is conqueror. We have been told, we've been shown, it has been revealed to us how this warfare ultimately is going to end. God, through his Son, will reign supreme. And what Jesus invites us to do is to join him, to join his side, the side that we are made originally to be on. He wants to spare us from the coming destruction of the devil and his angels. Of course, all of that is borne out in a book like Revelation in vivid detail, showing us that ultimately Jesus is conqueror. I'm reminded of what Paul says in Romans chapter 8 as he thinks about how there's going to be a culmination of God's purposes. And what he says, as wonderful as it is, he says that there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God in Christ, and that through him we're more than conquerors. In 1 Corinthians 15, similarly, as he writes about the consequence of the resurrection of Jesus, death has been defeated. It's been reversed. It has no hold on us. It does not have the final word over us. We can have eternal life through our belief in Jesus as our conqueror. So we must hear him lastly. And that's what was stated by the Father on this occasion. There are several points at time in the ministry of Jesus where God put his seal of approval on Jesus. We think about his baptism, for example. That's what's going on at the Transfiguration. God puts his seal of approval for the benefit of Peter, James, and John. They need to have their faith bolstered in who Jesus is, especially in light of how Jesus is planning to use them in the future. So he says, listen to them. Had they been listening to him? You know, in Mark's account of these events, Jesus rebukes them after he tells them how they've got to deny themselves. He rebukes them and warns them about if there is anyone who is ashamed of me and my words, that he will be ashamed of them in the new world. So Jesus has made the point clear. The Father makes the point clear. We must hear him. And hearing is believing. Hearing is obeying. Hearing is serving and supporting. Hearing is following behind him. What Jesus needed at this moment was the unwavering support of the apostles to go back to Jerusalem to do what he had to do for the salvation of the human family. We must hear Jesus. We have no other alternative. It is only logical. It is only logical that we would choose the winning side of this great spiritual warfare in the middle of which we are caught up. On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not withstand it. Thank you.